Thank you very much, and I'm very honoured to be here this afternoon to share a few thoughts. I'm particularly honoured to be here in this DCU Centre for Climate and Society that maybe allows us to start thinking about these issues in a big, interconnected way. And John, you said lifelong. My interest in this, I think for most people here, I'm sure it's lifelong interest in what's happening to our connection with nature, to nature. I just pick out a couple of things in my experience, and maybe others, I don't know if had the same experience, but I remember as a young boy, very young, about 6 or 7 or 8, I guess, 7, probably even earlier, grew up in Dundrum, and just one of those absolute clear moments that I can still remember, the joy of being alive. I remember it was just literally, it was a suburban street in like nothing fancy in South Dublin, but I just remember the sense that I was looking at some tree or bush, or I remember just that sense, wow, I'm here in this incredible place. And I know that sounds so corny or obvious, but for me it was one of those moments of absolute joy and tangible and real, and informs me in everything in my life, I guess. I similarly, at the age of 16, I was lucky because I wasn't a great student, and we did a course in our school in ecology, specialising in parkland ecology, and it was the first time in school that something actually meant something to me, that I was really learning. It was relevant, because I was learning about what's going on around me in the world. We were incredibly lucky. It was 79, we were reading Silent Spring, Gaia Theory, Limits to Growth, all the seminal environmental texts from the 70s and late 60s. And it was brilliant because it was active learning in nature, in teams. And that was the second, I suppose. And I remember towards the end of that, just before the exams, I was so imbued, embodied in this study. I remember having a similar sort of moment. I was walking through a park in Dublin and having that sense of connection. Personal, very deep sense of awareness of being in the world. And in that course, we were getting all the latest scientific analysis that if we didn't change our ways in our relationship with nature, we risk losing half of all wildlife within my lifetime. 45 years later, we have lost half of the natural world wildlife by invertebrate body mass weight. And we hadn't heeded the warning. Everyone knew back in the 70s and 80s, the science was clear that the loss of biodiversity, the path we were on, unless we changed our ways, was going to lead to the threads of the natural world being torn apart. And that's what's happened. And we have to reverse that now so that we don't see our natural systems completely disintegrating and that wonder of being in a wonderful world much diminished, because it's a world with less bird life, insect life, where our waters are polluted, our air is polluted, our soils are depleted. That has to change. And I believe that urge or that impulse or that motive belongs to absolutely everyone. That study that I did at that time was the study of ecology. And I think that is still the central thing we need at this time, because it brings certain characteristics. It brings an understanding of interconnection, of the connected nature between us and each other, and us with nature, and all the natural systems within the natural world. It values diversity, and it recognises, I think, when we're looking at various issues, that, for example, in tackling climate change, it's nature-based solutions that are going to be the main response in what we need to do. We're in the middle, if I can, and I'll come back at any other aspect of what we're doing in government, but we're in the middle of what I think is the most important project within our programme for government, which was commitment to do what was called a land use review. It was such a sensitive issue, we couldn't even call it land use plan for fear that someone might think we were telling a farmer what to do. We're halfway through the project. The EPA and Teagasc have presented the land use evidence review, which is starting to take an ecological understanding of what's happening on our island and what we need to do. And now we're moving to the next phase of that, and I wanted to share a few thoughts just on how that will happen, that needs to work. Firstly, this will not work if it's a politics of division. If it's a politics of rural Ireland versus urban Ireland, young versus old, rich versus poor, left versus right, I don't believe that firstly understands the level of interconnection we all have, but also to make this leap we need to make to restore nature and to stop runaway climate change. Every place matters, every person matters, and the scale of the change we need means it won't work if we leave any section of society behind. It does have to be a just transition. In that land use review then, the next phase we go to, I believe the approach we'll take is first of all seeking agreement on what we do agree on, setting out some of the key principles that I think all political parties and independents share and agree. You hear all the time this being framed as rural independents versus Greens, rural versus urban. I don't see that as the case. The evidence, the EPA carried out a really detailed societal analysis on people's attitudes to climate change. It showed there was only a very small, less than 5%, what you might call climate skeptic community in our country. It showed over 80% seeing the need for climate action as being part of their integral sense of the future. The principles I believe we need to agree with at the start of our review of land use is first and foremost that it is science-based. It's based on accurate analysis of what's happening. Secondly, the land use review has to optimise 5 things. It has to optimise, firstly, rural development. This is about development of our society within nature and with nature. It has to reduce the amount of carbon emissions so that we live within the IPCC Paris Climate Agreement. It has to stop the destruction of nature and see the restoration of biodiversity. And it has to stop and reduce the amount of water and air pollution that has taken place in this country, going from 500 pristine rivers down to 20, already now being above or close to being above the levels of air pollution for the likes of ammonia, which affects our hearts, our lungs, our very health. Also, the principle in my mind, I think we can agree on when it comes to land use, is that it should be based on retaining a family farming system as part of that societal approach to what we need to do. Critically, in my mind, go back to that first principle around social development, rural protection. I came out today and there were young farmers were coming up, young people from Knocknafarma, coming to the doors of government buildings. And they're absolutely right that we need to protect and enhance and ensure rural Ireland is centre stage in this transformation. There are various aspects to that. I'm absolutely convinced that the best way to get a new generation of young farmers involved in farming is in this green route. Because the payments we will make for the nature-based solutions are the best guarantee of their livelihood and their being able to raise a family in rural Ireland versus competing or relying on international market commodity prices. The income will come from rewarding our farmers, our foresters, our nature protection people for the skills they have in that regard. Secondly, in the area of forestry, and I know you'd own Dalton earlier on, I don't know if Owen's here, I was fascinated in his work, his latest book, and what he's doing down in the Beara Peninsula. And we will need a change in Irish forestry. That's absolutely certain and clear. What we did over the last 50, 60 years, last 30 particularly, in terms of planting on those wet peatlands, uplands lands with monoculture, clearfell, conifer plantations, that cannot be the future of Irish forestry. We need a range of different solutions, a range of rewilding options, a range of forestry which does still provide us with the lumber that we need for embodied carbon in the buildings, with cross-laminated timber and other Irish timber products. But forestry cannot alone be just a commercial exercise in increasing output, in measuring everything by square metres gone through the sawmills. It has to be central to providing a rich, biodiverse, protected island. Pippa Hackett, my colleague in government, has delivered a new forestry programme. We're waiting for European state aid rules. Once we get that, it goes straight into action. And it is transformative. It does meet that social requirement of providing a very good income, particularly in my mind, not just for foresters, but for farmers as well, who might want to part some of the field, use some of their fields for forestry production. I had the great privilege of meeting Herman Shear, who was one of the leading pioneers in the whole renewable green revolution. He was actually an SPD politician. But the closing paragraphs of his novel, The Solar Century, his book, keep coming back to me. That it's the foresters and the farmers who will be the front line in the climate revolution and in restoring nature, because they have the expertise of their own land as to what needs to be done. Part of it will be farmed, and increasingly those farms, the most marginal farms, will still require to be grazed. Because if we just let those 20% of marginal peatlands typically go, not to be grazed, you would just see birch and alder restore, and the carbon would be released, and we would not meet our climate targets. So we need to manage that farmland in a way that's really clever, manage the water levels so that it's still grazed, but the carbon is stored. And in doing that, I'm absolutely certain we can get a premium on our export markets, because we are a food exporter, that justifies and pays for that farmer to have a decent living. One change we need to make in forestry, and I'd ask this directly to DCU, is how come you don't have a forestry programme? You've only 2 third-level colleges in Ireland, UCD and Waterford, which run forestry courses. In my mind, we're going to see forestry expand to some 30% of our land use, restoring biodiversity as we do it. That will not happen on the tiny number of young people who are currently taking on that type of education and that type of job. If you want to be a climate hero, if you want to be part of the environmental movement which is delivering solutions, it's into the forestry and farming programs, as well as the building world, is where we need to go. Our bogs will also be critical. We've started changing. Bord na Móna, the change that's taken place there is real. It's not just the marketing ads you see. They are going from brown to green. And economically, it makes sense. They're starting to thrive. We're expanding their budget, their lending capability. They're employing now people using often the same skills that took to drain the bog to restore the bog and re-wet it. And I think that management of our wetlands, if we get our forestry and our wetlands, particularly bogs, right, and also turn our farming in this direction where it's less intense, where it plays a critical role in restoring the water quality of our rivers by moving away from the excess nutrient farming system we have at the present to a managed, really smart system that lowers the cost by reducing the cost of having to pay for fertilisers. Those 3 changes restore the way we live on this land, give us an income to make sure that there's a very strong, vibrant farming and forestry and nature restoration communities, and we steer ourselves towards restored natural systems, which completely changes how we feel about living in this world. The sense of pride, the sense of purpose, the sense of place is what's the most important thing in this. Going back to what I said at the start, about how each of us intrinsically, in our own consciousness, in our own living awareness, have this capability, have this necessity within us. Lastly, I'd say 2 or 3 things. Firstly, it is every place matters. And that kid growing up in suburban Dublin has as much right of a connection to the natural world as someone on the west of Ireland in a rural, most naturally rich area. There's a nature restoration law which has been devised in the European Union at this time. The COREPER meeting, the working group meeting tomorrow and Friday, I think it is coming to what we call a general purpose or general agreement on what that nature restoration law is. It's probably one of the most critical pieces of legislation going through the European Parliament and Council at this time. It's really important that it's not just seen as a rural thing. It's really important, in my mind, take our river, Talca down the road, or my river, the Dodder. We start to look at our rivers within our urban areas, start to design wetland areas, even within our gardens, even within our parks, that we manage the restoration of nature in our cities and towns, as well as in the country. That's not impossible. When I grew up as a child, you left a jam jar open, within seconds, you had wasps and bees circling around. That doesn't happen anymore. We can return to that much more vibrant, diverse, urban natural system as well as rural. The funding, as I said, needs to come from the state, from Europe, but also the large corporations which are profiting at present. What did Kerry Group announce today? 3.7 billion euros profits. Some of that needs to go to their meeting their environmental obligations by their paying their farmers more. And lastly, and this is where this organisation in DCU, the Centre for Climate and Society, you mentioned DCU's capability in its master's programme, which is well recognised. More than anything else, we need to get the framing of this right. How we actually discuss it, how we present it. I know I heard earlier on, you had a media panel here. Did I hear Kevin Backer saying that this needs to be in the news 365 days a year, which is great. But not if it's just one versus the other. If it's constantly reverting to this conflict story as a way of framing climate or the environment. It doesn't do justice to the reality. That EPA analysis showed rural people are just as interested in the climate and the environment as urban people, and vice versa. So the framing is important, how we tell the story, how we listen to each other and share perspectives and be willing to admit mistakes and reverse and go back and accelerate in the direction we need to go. That's why I'm very glad to be here at DCU today, to listen now and answer any questions, because I think what's going on in your School of Communications is as important as what's going on in any school of science or technology or industrial development. It's how we tell the story is going to determine whether we can make the leap. Thank you.
Okay, so Minister Ryan has said he takes some questions, and we'll start with the nearest one here. So if you want to, here in the front. There's some roving microphones so the audience can hear your question as well.
Thank you. Claire O'Connor from Friends of the Earth, and also a graduate of the DCU Masters as well. I have a question to Minister Ryan on heat policy specifically. Ireland currently has the lowest levels of renewable heat in the EU. And unfortunately, we're not seeing much movement with that. And we're also risking homeowners in particular being locked into fossil fuels for years to come. In January and February of this year, over 500 new gas grid connections were made to homes. And last year, as part of the free energy upgrade scheme, which is a free retrofit scheme for households who are in energy poverty, 759 gas boilers and 471 oil boilers were installed in these homes who are at risk of energy poverty, and just 40 heat pumps were installed across that scheme. So I'm just wondering, and I know the SEAI heat study last year said that we immediately need to see a plan across all sectors for phase out of fossil fuels. And I'm just wondering, where is the plan for the phase out of fossil fuel heating? When will the SEAI stop installing fossil fuel boilers in the homes of people in energy poverty, which is locking them into fossil fuels for up to 15 years? And when will we see no new gas grid connections as well? Thank you.
Yeah. We can take maybe questions in groups of three, because already I can see lots of hands. So just here in the middle.
Hello.
No, you're fine.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your heartfelt thoughts. You finished off talking a little bit about change, and we had somebody earlier talking about changing politics. Do you have any vision for rewilding politics? Maybe can politics reflect nature a little bit, please?
Come on here just on the edge of the steps, and then I'll come back again to another round in a minute. We'll just take them in groups of 3.
Minister, this is a question, I suppose, the environment is impacted in so many ways, but in terms of absent from the debate here today is nobody is questioning what I call the growth illusion. In other words, there's this myth we can continue with ongoing growth. To give you an example, there was 228 cars per 1,000 people here in Ireland when my son was born in 1990. There's now, in 2020, there's 446 per 1,000. And I just wonder, when is government planning going to move to a sort of a circular economy, where in terms of policy making, economic growth is looked at in terms of the environment and its impact on the environment? At the moment, economic growth seems to have priority in all policy making. And have you any plans for developing railways as a way of transporting people, particularly in rural Ireland, between urban centres at a reasonable price, like the Germans have done, and developing more railways rather than more roads? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. On each of those, firstly, Claire, you're right. Heat policy is the one where we've had the least progress, which is holding us back on meeting our targets. And it's a fundamental problem. We need to stop the deployment of new oil and gas-fired boilers. We need to switch to heat pumps at scale in both our homes and in the industrial. Anything under 120 degree heat needs to be done in that way. I'm very glad to hear DCU is looking at doing district heating. That also has a huge potential, particularly with geothermal or other waste heat sources. There are alternatives which are more economic, more secure, as well as being cleaner. And we have not made sufficient progress. I believe that is changing as we speak. That we are actually, and we will through regulations say, that in both industrial and the domestic side, it actually has to end and we have to make the switch. So we do give the real certainty to the alternative better. This will only work if there's better alternative. The truth is heat pumps are a better heating system, and systematically we will switch from one to the other in the same way that we systematically switched from the 1960s. We had no central heating. By the 1980s, late 80s, 95% of Irish homes had central heating. So we've shown we can do the change. In a similar time frame in the next 2 decades, we will switch away from fossil fuel heating towards heat pumps and insulation and district heating in our domestic settings, and heat pumps for industrial use, anything under 120 degrees, and then alternative sources for heat above that, hydrogen and so on. That is absolutely has to happen if we're to meet our climate targets. I accept your point that not enough has been done, but we are working with SEAI to make sure we do deliver. Can I say the second one, rewilding politics? And I absolutely understand the instincts, the frustration, the sense of, is our political system really up to this challenge or the scale of the change?
You are very brave.
Well, not brave.
You're in the jungle.
No, I would say it's fairly representative of Irish people, the Dáil. And I think the first thing, and this is the difficult thing, in a world where all the social media news systems now lead or tend towards polarisation and feeding you back the same views that you already have, the last thing we need, if rewilding means that we're confrontational and antagonistic and...
Reflecting nature.
Oh, I agree with that.
How do we reflect nature?
Our job in politics is to do it through the policies that we implement. It's all very fine in words. It has to be in deeds and in action. But I think I just keep going back to this point about, Michael Fitzmaurice on the news now about a new paper and so on. I sat beside Michael, new party, sorry. I sat beside Michael for 5 years in opposition, and actually you'd be amazed at the amount of times we had common cause and understanding of what the situation is. And so my job, I think, in terms of rewilding is not to allow that to go down the road of us versus them, rural versus urban. It's actually almost the rewilding is in actually listening and coming back in a respectful way and not disrespecting whoever. I mean, as long as it's not violent politics, but it is to engage in a politics which gets away from the confrontational towards collaboration, towards understanding interconnection, which is the core of an ecological approach in my mind. With regard to the growth illusion, can I give you another example that I'm confronting at the moment? Because I'm working with Dublin Port. There was, they have a 3FM project which is out for public consultation at the moment. I was out last week because I felt I had to speak. Because no one has answered a question that I've been asking for the last 2 years. In the plans they have, where we're going from currently about 35 million tonnes of goods coming in and out of Dublin Port, about 5 million tonnes of which are fossil-related products that won't be there in 20 years' time. Why is it that there's plans to go to 77 million tonnes of goods moving in and out of the port? The simple question I've asked is, what are we consuming twice of in 18 years' time? And yes, there will be some 20% increase because of population increase. Our country's growing rapidly, but not 100%. And I do think that change of thinking towards this ever onwards growth in consumption is at the corner of the green political perspective that now needs to be shared across every political system. And there is an understanding in Europe on this, at European heads. Like when von der Leyen came to the Irish Dáil, she spoke a green message, as did Joe Biden. The reason she did is because there's a realisation, we, the wealthiest part of the world, when I grew up, we, the 20% wealthiest, consumed 80% of the resources. That's not a future stable world. Our job in Europe is to use really clever use of digital technology, circular economy, green use of our own natural renewable resources instead of just consuming and importing from the rest of the world. That's the only viable, successful economic as well as environmental strategy. And I just think it takes time for some of our institutions to catch up with an understanding of what the future is. It will not be doubling consumption. I was talking to someone today who's involved looking at some of this. What was some of the biggest items that's counting for all the growth? Fast fashion, where Amazon arrives every week with another pullover that you wear for a week and then discard, which is almost unrecyclable in the nature of the fabrics. You can look at areas where we can actually change the way we consume, not to be any poorer, never to do this as are you doing the right thing or putting the blame on the individual, but our systems can't be designed around ever-expanding consumption because, as you say, there are ultimately fundamentally limits to growth. I had the great pleasure in the work I've done the last few years I met Daniel Meadows, one of the authors of the Limits to Growth. Their first systems analysis from the 1970s is bearing out to be true, just as we got that warning in class back 45 years ago that we would lose biodiversity. There was a similar warning from that first use of computing power to do a systems analysis of the world. And it showed that either you couldn't see population, development and environment all being protected in this 21st century on the path we were on. Unfortunately, we're still on that path. Now, I don't believe population is the biggest constraint or concern. We're going to peak in population much sooner than people previously expected. It's consumption and the protection of the environment are the two variables that have to meet.
Thank you, Minister. Just in the blue top there, just up to the, and then this lady here in the middle, the grey, if you could get the second microphone in.
Thank you, Minister, for addressing the conference. You spoke quite a bit about forestry and how it's a big land use and it needs to be changed, and I totally agree with that. The new forestry programme, which was meant to start in January, offered more or less double grants and premiums, which was very welcome. However, as you say, it's gone to Brussels for approval. How long do you expect that will take? Because there's a logjam of applications now. And people aren't getting, there's no planting going on as a result, or other forestry activities.
Okay, we'll take a group again. Here in the middle, has the microphone.
Hello, thank you, Minister, for taking questions. I think I was next. I have seen, we know today, everybody here today knows that the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis or biodiversity loss are interlinked. That the climate crisis is driving biodiversity loss. So it was really concerning for me recently to hear media reports that the Minister is doing a U-turn on the Green Party's position in opposition to LNG. Liquefied natural gas is a highly polluting fossil fuel, about equivalent, its emissions are about equivalent to those of coal. So I don't see how a Green Party minister can possibly countenance allowing LNG into this country. So please, I hope you will give me a reassurance that these reports are mistaken or that something was misconstrued, because I don't see how you can be here today and, speaking about how you care about biodiversity loss and yet be considering LNG imports.
We'll take one more here and go back to the other side.
Thank you. Hi, Minister. I'm Karen Czeselsky from the Environmental Pillar. Sometimes as a member of civil society and certainly just an ordinary citizen, it seems that public consultation and engagement processes can feel like box-ticking exercises. We say it again and again that we want faster, fair climate action and for policies to result in nature restoration and protection. How can we improve policy coherence to ensure the delivery of the ambitious plans that we have? And also, how do we improve the ways that we in communities around the country can engage and participate in policy making? Thank you.
First on forestry. You're right. The policy was agreed back in November, a funding of 1.3 billion, and it's incredibly, compared to previous planned regimes, very generous in my mind. It will see, I think, a huge expansion in forestry because it makes sense. It makes economic sense. It is very frustrating in our system that it takes time then to deliver sometimes on promised policies. In this case, the main delay coming from our European Union, where you have state aid rules and other processes that you have to go through. It's been very frustrating that that's taken a number of months. My mind, I've said to my colleague, Mr. Hackett, we have to push Europe to turn that into a small number of weeks now, because we do need to get that decision turned around. As soon as we do, I'm very confident we're going to see a major expansion in the Irish forestry sector, which is why we need young people. But I accept your point. Given the scale of the crisis and the need for speed, that is very frustrating, and we do need to try and shorten it. With regard to LNG, can I just be clear, first of all, I don't know. There is no intention on my behalf or the Green Party of making any U-turn with regard to keeping fossil fuels in the ground, not seeing commercial LNG facilities being developed in this island. That's absolutely clear and true. There is, I think I was quoting that, what people got spared about. I also said something that was also true, that the world has changed in the last year because of the war in Ukraine, and the blowing up of 2 gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea is something we cannot completely ignore. Now, the truth is the war is accelerating renewables more than anything else, to an extent that our need for gas in the next decade will be hugely diminished. And that is the best way of us providing security in not needing imported LNG. We will need, in my mind, for a short number of years, some capacity to have a storage facility, not commercial LNG, a storage facility that in the event of any disruption, we're able to provide the basic needs for our people, to keep our hospitals open, to keep our food systems working, and all the other essential needs. That does not mean, though, that we reverse track or do any U-turn with regard to the expansion or use of commercial LNG. I have to wait the Energy Security Report, which in the coming months will set out how we best deliver that short-term storage solution. I believe that is fully compatible with what we've been saying over the years. Lastly, Karen, I think if I was saying principles earlier on around how we approach the land use review, I think partnership is one of the strengths of our country. We sit down with the environmental pillar, we sit down with the trade unions, we sit down with the employers, and we try and we listen and try and work out what is the best approach that we need to take. What I've heard you say as an example in recent years, the environmental pillar, not any one individual, to give an example of how public participation might work is what EirGrid have done with the development of their consultation process in their shaping our electricity future. My understanding is, and I was involved, but there's a wider sense that actually that was a good example of how could and should be done. And evidence coming out from that, whereas 10 years ago we had wars when it came to developing our electricity grid system, which is critical to our meeting our climate targets. Now, we saw we were able to get the new interconnector with France through the planning system without a single objection down in Cork. We've seen them able to build out in Connacht and the Midlands other projects that had been delayed for years. So the approach EirGrid took with a real detailed, in-depth, bottom-up, engaged consultation process, I think, provides a model of what we could do elsewhere and how we can. And I mean, obviously beyond that, it's the PPN networks. It's getting involved in local government. It's getting involved. A lot of the environmental change we have to make is at a local level, and I think it's strengthening our local government response through both our people getting engaged in politics and local government or engaged in the PPN process is the second answer I would have to your question.
Okay. Do we have 5 minutes? Okay. I thought we were right for that. So here in the middle, and then 2 on the edge here. And then we'll have to call a halt there. So we start up here at the back.
Hi, so my name is Lauren, and I'm a researcher at Trinity College Dublin, and I'm looking at lobbying strategy in Ireland. As you know, when you implement a policy, you have to, select winners and losers based on how you choose to prioritize stakeholders. My question for you is, what tools and what strategies do you use to prioritize stakeholders when you are implementing a strategy or a policy related to climate change?
Hi Minister, and just like to thank DCU for an excellent day today. My name is Gary Tyrrell with Climate Ambassadors. And Minister, I'd just like to ask you, I was just thinking today about Padraig Fogarty's Whittled Away book, and one of the big things he talked about was the MPWS and the funding, that they need for their really important work. And I saw some of their great work they've done recently with peatland restoration. So just on that theme of rewilding and renewing today, just wondering, is there, on those extra billions that the government has now in its back pocket, is there any chance of that, some of that going over to the MPWS, please?
Final question here.
Minister Ryan, I have a question about language. It's kind of a bit more abstract, but in terms of the language we use to talk about these issues, and I suppose the most stark example it always gets me, and I think it annoys a lot of people, is just that we talk about the environment, as if it's something over there, that's not something we live and breathe in. But it has very, very specific ways of confusing and misleading the discussion in policy terms. And I think, the best and most perhaps damaging example in society at the moment is forestry policy. And we talk about we got 10% forest cover. But the truth is that Sitka spruce monoculture plantations are not forests. They're tree farms, essentially. So, and I've seen something quite disturbing there recently that was saying that in terms of the definition of a forest at EU level, that can include areas that are clear-felled, that can include areas that are in the process of being converted to forests, which are also monocultures. And so, I guess there is an argument to be made to change that type of language. So I'm wondering, does your department have any comment on that, any intentions around that? Thank you.
Can I, firstly, Lauren, on the issue of lobbying or how do we base decisions? I think in the climate area, everything is coming from the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. That provides the legal structure. The Paris Climate Agreement is within the UNFCCC process. It's a further iteration, and it's a legal text. I remember in the negotiation of in Paris, talking to one of the Irish negotiators, the critical thing was not to shorten it. It actually gives its strength, give its legal power, even though there's no compellability on any particular country in any particular year. It is the legal structure, and included critically within that, the aim of keeping temperature increase below 1.5 degrees is the key metric. And then when you come, so it's coming, these layers of legal treaty structures brings it down to the European Union as a party to the to the UNFCCC and the Paris Climate Agreement, and our commitment as a wealthy, developed part of the world to meet our reductions, roughly a 50% reduction in this decade and net zero by 2050 at the latest, that provides the structure. And then you bring it down to a national level in the National Climate Plan, where we have to, ton by ton, work out what is the way that we meet our European commitments. And in that, the way the law is devised in Ireland, it's a legal subset of the Climate Paris Agreement, and within that, the sectoral emission ceilings are set out to, in some ways, answer your question: how do you decide which sector? And then within sectors, you have policies beneath it. The scale of change and the leap is so big that we are absolutely to the max, and we have to do further work this year on land use and in our allocation emissions from the black box, because we didn't have all the science and information at our disposal last year. But to answer your question, that frames it more than anything else. And then, so when you come down to individual policy decisions to meet the sectoral targets, no lobbyist is going to necessarily have a field day or have room to manoeuvre, because there's such a constraint on the scale of ambition. It's the law, and it's the tiers of legal requirements, I would say, is what is driving a lot of the decisions that we need to make. Secondly, Gary, on MPWS. The MPWS was filleted after the crisis, financial restrictions. They saw their numbers plummet. They didn't get replacements. They were not getting the resources they needed to protect our natural systems. I believe among various things our party has done, government, difficult as it is, what Malcolm Noonan has done has seen a significant restoration of people and resources and pride in the MPWS, and we're only starting. There's a major review within a short number of months, a reimagining in my mind of how MPWS what it should and needs to do, and the resources it needs to do it. And yes, it does need additional resources. And yes, in my mind, rather than putting all our funds into sovereign wealth funds, we should and we will be looking at how could we invest some of the excess funds we have at this time in nature-based solutions that the MPWS can be part of providing. Nothing's decided on that, nothing's agreed on that, but it makes eminent sense for us to invest in our own land, our own natural systems, and in many instances it will be the lowest cost solution to meet both our climate and our biodiversity restoration targets which are now far stronger because of the agreement in Montreal last December on COP15 on biodiversity, which is similar to the COP in climate, in that it has legal impact in terms of saving places for nature, and that it doesn't always have to be funding. It can be by dint of regulation, to say certain amounts of areas of space have to be used in that way, and the MPWS manage and oversee that. And lastly, with regard to language, can I just pick up one point? I think you're absolutely right that the wording, the language we use, the likes of the wording you said in forestry. Years ago, after I lost my seat, I was involved with an organisation which was organised a series of climate conversations in a safe space, 5th province, where people would have the right to say whatever and respected and listened to. We did one in the Byrne College of Art, we did one in St Patrick's Cathedral, in the Bailey Lighthouse, but we also did one in the Abbey Theatre. And the best climate communicator I've ever heard was in that Abbey Theatre. We asked Tommy Tiernan to say what he thought. And he opened up by saying, don't talk to me about nature if you don't have the human being at its core. Don't talk to me about the environment and the human as if we're not all part of the same thing. And that blew my 6-year-old mind away, which understood this connection between ourselves and the natural world in an intrinsic way. And sorry if that's abstract or high-flying, but I think it's true. We speak about not a separation, but a connection, about us being part of nature, and then I think we restore it in a way that's beyond compare.
Minister, thank you very much. We did promise Mr. Ryan we'd get him out of here on time. We didn't quite keep our promise, but we're close enough. But I really am grateful, not just for your own thoughts, which are obviously very personal and came across as really well felt, but also for taking the time to take as many questions as you possibly could. So thank you very much.
Thank you.